Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling Rupert of Hentzau by Anthony Hope, published in the year 1898, the sequel to The Prisoner of Zenda. 3 years have passed since an Englishman wore the crown of a foreign land and gave it back again. A story about a letter that should never have been written, about an enemy who returns laughing, and about a man who must once more choose between love and honor. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried back to Ruritania. My name is Fritz von Tarlenheim, and whoever knows the story of the prisoner of Zenda knows me too. I was there, back then, when we set a stranger on the throne of our country because the true king lay drugged in a cellar. And I have kept silent for 3 years, as we all kept silent. Old Zapt, the queen, the king, and I. But now I set it all down, for the story has found its end, and silence alone no longer carries it. 3 years then had passed. Rudolph V sat upon his throne, and Flavia had become his queen, as the country had wished. But the king had been another man since the days of Zenda. The captivity in the keep, the fever, the fear, all that he had never shaken off again. He had grown mistrustful, irritable, weak of health, a man who slept badly and saw shadows, and the burden of gratitude pressed on him more than the crown ever had. For he knew to whom he owed everything, an Englishman who wore his face and who in that one summer had been the better king. Such knowledge does not make a sick man healthier. The queen bore her lot as she bore everything, upright and without complaint. She was a faithful wife to the king. She nursed him in his bad hours and stood beside him at every appearance before the country. What it cost her, only those who loved her saw, and I was among those who saw it. For her heart had been given away since that summer, and it was as faithful as everything else about her. It knew only the one. Once a year, that was the quiet custom that had established itself, I traveled to a small town outside the country and met a messenger there, or he came himself, Rudolf Rassendyll from England. Then I handed him a box, in it a rose and a slip of paper with 3 words, and took the same message back with me. It was little, and it was everything. 3 times I had traveled so. In the 3rd year, however, in that autumn of which I mean to tell, the queen gave me more than the rose. She gave me a letter. I warned her. I do not say this to make myself look better, for what happened afterward happened under my hand, and I bear my share of it. But I warned her that evening in Strelzow when she gave me the writing. She stood at the window of her room, and she said that for 3 years she had sent 3 words and had lived on them, a year long each time. Now the king had grown sicker, and her life stiller and darker, and once, a single time in all those years, she wished to write to him what she truly was and felt, so that he might for once read it in her own hand, and not only guess at it from 3 agreed-upon words. A letter, she said, only one. He would read it and burn it, that she knew. I took the letter, and I traveled. The way led, as in every year, across the border, into the little town of Wintenberg, where Rassendyll meant to meet me. And now I must speak of the man who gives this tale its name. Rupert of Hentzau was alive. He lived in exile, for after the events of Zenda, his return to Ruritania was forbidden on pain of death, his property confiscated, his name outlawed. But a man like Rupert does not rust in exile. He waits, and he scents the air. He kept to the borderlands with his cousin Count Luzau Rischenheim, a young, weak creature who admired him and was in thrall to him, and with the remnants of his old following. And Rupert had in all those years never given up one thought. that there was a secret that throttled the king of Ruritania, and that this secret, rightly grasped, was the key to his own return. For he knew the truth of Zenda. He was one of the few living who knew it. What he lacked was a proof, or a means of pressure. How he learned of my yearly journey I do not know for certain to this day. I fear my servant was bought. In any case, Rupert knew that autumn when I traveled, where I traveled, and what I carried with me. And this time I carried more than a rose. In Wittenberg, on the evening of my arrival, I walked through a narrow lane toward the appointed inn, and there they were waiting for me, 3 men. It was quick and almost soundless. A blow, a knee in the back, hands that searched my pockets, and when I came to myself again on the paving stones, the box was gone, and the letter with it. Above me, however, in the light of the lane's lamp, no one stood any longer. Only a voice came out of the dark, young and amused, and it said I should greet the Queen and thank her for her open words. Then footsteps, a laugh, silence. Rupert of Hentzau had the letter. What saved me was the second traveler expected that night in Wittenberg. Rudolf Rassendyll arrived hours after me, found me bandaged and feverish at the inn, and had everything reported to him twice with that calm thoroughness I knew in him. He was unchanged, the same red hair, the same calm, only grown riper, more gathered, as though the years in England had worn away everything superfluous from him. When I had ended, he sat still a long while. Then he said, not to me, more to himself, "The letter is a weapon, and Rupert will carry it where it cuts deepest, to the king." And he stood up and began to act, and from that hour the lead lay with him again, as in the old days, without anyone saying so. A telegram went that same night to Zapt in Strelzau, in our old sign language that no stranger could read. "Rupert has goods, expects buyers, guard the shop." For that was the next concern. Rupert himself could not cross the border. Death stood on his head, but his cousin Rischenheim was of unstained name and could travel wherever he wished, even to court. And rightly. Even while we were still conferring, we knew it as well as if we had read it. Rischenheim would request an audience with the king, deferential and harmless, and in his breast pocket there would lie a copy of the letter. The original Rupert kept, of course. A man like him does not give the weapon out of his hand. He only shows the blade. Rassendyll resolved on what I would not have dared to think. He would go to Ruritania himself, in secret, across the border under a false name, his face beneath a hat and a turned-up collar. It was madness. We both knew it. 2 men with the king's face in a country that knew only one. Every station master, every gendarme could unleash the catastrophe. But the letter weighed heavier. I myself had to stay behind a day with fever and a bandaged head, and followed only later. What happened at Castle Zenda I know from Zapt's and Rassendyll's mouths, and so I tell it. Zapt had understood the telegram. When Rischenheim's request for an audience arrived, the king was staying with a small retinue at Castle Zenda, the queen with her court in Strelzau. The old colonel took the matter into his own hands, granted the audience in the king's name, and set it for the morning after next. Then he rode out to meet Rassendyll. In a forester's hut in the woods of Zenda that same night, the two sat together again, the old soldier and the Englishman, and forged the plan. Rischenheim should have his audience, but the king before whom he would spread out his copy should not be the king. The audience the next morning was a masterpiece, and I wish I could have seen it. The true king lay at that hour, all unsuspecting, in the hunting lodge deep in the forest, where he had withdrawn with his forester Herbert and his great hound Boris to hunt for a few days. The illness made him shy of people, and Zapt had cleverly used this absence. But at Castle Zenda, there sat in the audience chamber a king who was none. Rassendyll, shaved, dressed, instructed, with Bernenstein at the door, a young officer of the guard who, since that night of Zenda, belonged to the few in the know and was true as steel. Rischenheim entered, bowed, pale, and one could see in the young count that the role his cousin had assigned him did not please him. He began with trifles, a request concerning a regiment, and then felt his way forward. There was a certain document that would open His Majesty's eyes about persons in the nearest circle of the throne. And he drew out the copy and read, with a faltering voice, the words of the Queen. One must picture the moment. He read to a man the words of love that were meant for that very man. Rassendyll listened, his face unmoved, and when Rischenheim finished, he stretched out his hand and said coolly that he wished to examine the sheet. Rischenheim gave it up. What else could he do? It was the king who commanded. Rassendyll ran his eyes over the lines, folded the paper, put it away, and then said, in the tone of a man who has concluded a tiresome piece of business, the writing was known to him, a forgery with which someone had already tried to trouble him once, and the Count would do well to beware of carrying such things further. For the rest, he would remain, until further notice, as a guest in the castle. Bernenstein led the bewildered man out, courteous and inescapable, and in a tower room, Rischenheim was, for the moment, out of the game. The copy had been rendered harmless. But the success carried its own curse, and Zapt grasped it first. Rupert was waiting somewhere outside for his cousin, and the cousin did not come. For anyone else, that would mean caution, retreat. For Rupert of Hentzau, it meant the opposite. If the messenger failed, he went himself, and he carried the original with him, and he knew what we had not considered, where the true king was to be found that day. For Rischenheim had reported it to him before he went into the castle, the hunt, the lodge, the small retinue. While we in Zenda were guarding a false king, Rupert of Hentzau was already riding through the forest toward the true one, with the Queen's letter in his breast pocket and without a single plan that could not have been expected of him. What happened in the hunting lodge was told by the forester Herbert, who lived long enough to tell it, and I give it as he said it. In the afternoon, a rider knocked, gave a false name, and was let in because he promised news from court. The king sat at the table, weary from the day's hunting, the great boarhound Boris at his feet. Rupert entered, and the king knew him at once, knew the man from the keep, from the worst weeks of his life, and started up and cried out for Herbert. But Rupert stayed calm, bowed, and said he came in peace. He brought His Majesty only a piece of reading that would interest him, and laid the letter on the table. The king read, and while he read, everything must have broken in him that the 3 years had painfully held together. The mistrust, the jealousy of the man with his face, the knowledge of his own weakness. He read the words of his wife to another, and this other was the one to whom he owed his throne and his life. He cried out. He called Rupert a liar and the lines a fabrication, and Rupert smiled and said His Majesty might examine the handwriting himself. He asked only one thing for this service, his pardon and his estates returned. Then the king grasped the whole transaction, and his fury threw itself upon the only one within reach. He tore the riding whip from its hook and struck Rupert across the face and called for his people. And then the catastrophe broke loose, as swiftly as misfortune happens. The hound Boris sprang at the stranger. Rupert put a bullet into his body. Herbert rushed in with the hunting spear, and in the turmoil of that narrow room, table and chairs overturned, the smoke of the shot in the air, Rupert stabbed and shot for his life, as he had always done, without hesitation and without mercy. When it grew still, Herbert lay mortally struck against the wall, the dog dead beside him. And the king of Ruritania lay across his chair, and Rupert of Hentzau stood there with a smoking weapon and looked upon his work. He had not meant to kill the king. There was no profit in it. A dead man could pardon no one. For a single heartbeat, Herbert said, the young lord had stood there and looked almost put out, like a gambler at whom a card has fallen too soon. Then he had bent down, taken the letter from the table, carefully put it away, set his hat on his head, and gone out, with a light step, and outside a horse had been heard, and then nothing more. In the night, Zapt and James, Rassendill's silent English servant, who wished to see that all was well on a patrol ride, found the hunting lodge thus: 2 dead, 1 dying, and the certainty that now everything in the world depended on no one learning what had happened here. For if the king died now, publicly, then the letter would come to light, and with it, the queen would fall. Zapt acted that night as only Zapt could act. He locked the truth away. The hunting lodge was bolted, the dying Herbert tended, and James, the quiet servant with the mind of a general, stayed behind as a guard. To the outside it was said the king was hunting on and wished for quiet. The sick man's shyness of people which had so often given us worry now became our protection. So we gained days. But what were days so long as Rupert carried the letter and lived? The hunter was now a hunted man. That, at least. His own mouth was the most dangerous piece of evidence against himself, for whoever showed the letter also showed the king's murder, which no one would believe of him as it had truly happened. Rupert needed a new bargain and a new buyer, and he was the man to find both, so he had to be found before he did. The chase shifted to Strelzow. There, our inquiries showed Rupert had turned to a house in the King's Street that belonged to an old woman named Holf. Yeah, one will remember. Her son had once stood on the drawbridge at Zenda. Into this wasp's nest his helper Bauer had also hurried ahead of him, a fellow with the face of a baker's boy and the soul of a knife. And to Strelzow now went Rudolf Rassendyll too, in the dark of a rainy evening, his hat low over his face, and I, by now back on my feet, with him. We took quarters with Bernstein's relatives, inconspicuously, and began to watch the house in the King's Street. But fate had yet another figure to set on the board. The Queen could bear it no longer in her castle. The news we had sent her in cautious hints had not stilled her fear but stoked it, and Flavia was not a woman who wished to perish waiting. Under the pretext of a vow in the cathedral, she came with a small retinue to Strelzow, and on the very evening of her arrival she stood face to face with Rudolf Rassendyll, for the first time in 3 years. I was witness to this meeting, and I say of it only this: not a word and not a gesture fell that could not have stood before all the world. And that was the most shattering thing about it. 2 people to whom a single glance would have been enough, and who permitted themselves none. They spoke of the letter, of Rupert, of the king whose death she did not yet know. For that, Rudolf resolved in that hour, she should learn only when the danger was past. Then, late in the night, came the messenger for whom we had waited. Bauer had been seen, and in the gable window of old Holf a light was burning. Rupert of Hentzau was in the house. What I now tell happened in the early morning, in the hours between night and day, and it happened quickly. Rudolf would not wait until Rupert found a way out. He went into the house in the King's Street himself, alone, through the front door, while Bernstein and I held the exits. Old Holf opened, and whatever she saw in his face, the king or the man of Zenda, it froze her long enough. Rudolf climbed the stairs toward the light in the gable. Above, in the attic room, Rupert of Hentzau stood at the table, counting money for his flight. I have often been asked what this last fight was like, and I must answer, I know it only from Rudolph's sparse words and from what the room told afterward. It was no duel by the rules of the fencing hall. It was cramped, it was silent, 2 men between table and sloping roof, the blades forced to short play, and neither cried for help, for neither of them could use witnesses. Rupert fought as he had lived, brilliant and without fear, and he laughed even now softly between the passes, and twice offered Rudolph to share the thing, the letter, the kingdom, the whole world. The 2 of them together could have it all. Rudolph did not answer. He fought with the calm I knew in him from the night in Zenda, step by step, and pressed the other away from the window, away from the door, into the corner under the slope, where the long blade of the taller man counted for nothing. There Rupert of Hentzau fell, run through, and even as he fell, Rudolph said later, he had smiled, as though this too were at the last a good jest that life had permitted itself with him. So died the man who lied more beautifully than others tell the truth, at 23 years of age, in an attic room above the King's Street, and with him the house of Hentzau went out. Rudolph took the letter from his breast pocket, the letter for which 3 men and a faithful dog had died, and burned it at the candle on the table, line by line, until nothing remained but black dust. Then he stepped to the window. But below, in the street, something had gathered in the dawn that was worse than any sword. People. The noise of the fight, old Hulf, Bauer's chatter, something had woken the quarter, and when Rudolph stepped out of the door, bareheaded, his red hair in the first light, a murmur ran through the lane, and then a cry, and then a shout from 100 throats. "The king! The king in Strelsau!" The crowd fell to its knees, they kissed his coat, they cheered him, and the morning bells began to ring. Rudolf Rassendyll stood on the steps of the house, and the capital of Ruritania lay at his feet and called him its king. And only a handful of people in the world knew that the king had lain dead for 3 days in the hunting lodge of Zenda. What came now was the heaviest hour, and it came not with swords, but in a quiet room. For now the crown of Ruritania lay before Rudolf Rassendyll for the 2nd time, and this time no one stretched out a hand to take it from him again. The king was dead and had no heir. The capital had that morning seen its supposed ruler cheered, and that night there happened what I set down, so that it may be known how faithfully men can err. We ourselves, Zapt, Bernenstein, and I, we begged him to stay. "Stay, king," we said. "You always were one in your heart. The country loves you, the queen loves you, and the truth lies buried in a hunting lodge that will keep silent." Rudolph heard us out a long while, and his face was calm, as always in the greatest moments. Then he said we should give him until morning. Then he would give his answer. But I looked at him, and I already knew the answer, and Zapt knew it too, and the old man had tears in his eyes for the only time since I knew him. Rudolf Rassendyll was not a man to build a crown upon a dead man and a lie. The answer of the morning we never heard, for as he crossed the square in the early light, James at his side, a figure detached itself from an archway. Bauer, Rupert's creature, the last remnant of the whole calamity, who wished to avenge his master or to be paid for his silence, who knows? A shot rang out, and Rudolf Rassendyll fell onto the pavement of Strelsau, in the city that took him for its king. They carried him into the palace, and he lived until the evening. The queen sat at his bed and held his hand, before all eyes, for a queen may sit at the bed of the king, and no one in the room but us knew that here a woman was not losing her ruler. He spoke with her once more, softly, and what was said belongs to them. Then he died in the evening light, and over the city the bells rang for the king, and this time, I thought, They rang for the first time for the right one. The rest is quickly told, and it is the story of a great silence. The hunting lodge of Zenda burned down that week, an accident, it was said, and with it perished what lay hidden there. Zapt and James did this last work alone and never spoke of it. But in the crypt of the Elfbergs at Strelzau, with all the pomp of the realm, a king was laid to rest, Rudolph V, and the country mourned him sincerely, for it had known him at the last gentler and greater than ever. Only a handful of people know who lies in that coffin, an Englishman who could have taken the crown twice and twice did not take it. Flavia has reigned ever since as queen, alone, honored, in black. And once a year, in autumn, a single red rose is carried down into the crypt, and no one at court asks any longer for whom it is. But I, Fritz von Tarlenheim, close my records here, and if anyone asks me whether I ever knew a king, I answer truthfully. One. And he never wore the crown by right, and was worthier of it than us all. That was our short retelling of Rupert of Hentzau by Anthony Hope. A letter, an enemy, a last summer in Ruritania, and a man who refused the crown a second time and gave everything for it. Some people reign a lifetime and leave nothing behind. He reigned 2 summers and left behind a rose that does not wither. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.